Welcome to Deep Dive, a sort of personal project that I felt I had to share. I have more than 30 books in queue and probably another 30 topics that I want to learn more about. And sometimes I want to hear a summary before I invest a couple of days of deep dive. This podcast is a result of that need. With the help of some Google apps and tools, what you have here is a podcast format that is surprisingly entertaining, even if it's a bit comprehensive. For this episode, we talk about The Secret Commonwealth of Robert Kirk. Our sources are The Secret Commonwealth of Elves, Fauns, and Fairies by Robert Kirk, Walker Between Worlds, a new edition of The Secret Commonwealth by Robert Kirk.
Okay, let's unpack this. A 17th century Scottish clergyman who, well, genuinely seemed to believe in fairies.
Right. It's quite the hook.
It really is. And that's our jumping off point today as we deep dive into a truly unique book, The Secret Commonwealth. A fascinating piece of work, actually, that one of you, our incredibly curious listeners, sent our way.
It's intriguing, isn't it? Because this isn't just some dusty collection of folklore. Robert Kirk, the minister up in Aberfoyle who penned this back in 1691, he approaches the subject of what he calls the subterranean inhabitants, fairies, basically with a seriousness that's almost scientific for the time.
Exactly. Forget the tiny wings and glitter. Kirk doesn't just dismiss these beings as fantasy or, the work of the devil, which was the common explanation back then.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, he considers them, and this is a direct quote, a mere fact in nature.
Which is pretty radical for a clergyman of that era.
Totally. And here's where it gets really interesting. Our mission today is to sort of get under the skin of these beliefs. How did they fit alongside 17th century Christianity?
Right. And why would a learned man, a scholar like Kirk, even bother documenting them so meticulously?
Exactly. We're looking at early folklore, sure, but also maybe the very beginnings of psychical research and potentially even some echoes of ancient shamanistic practices. It's a lot to unpack.
It really is. And you have to remember the context. The late 17th century, a time of big changes. The Enlightenment is sort of brewing.
Yeah.
Yet here's Kirk, immersed in the Gaelic-speaking Highlands, treating these local beliefs with remarkable gravity, almost like a natural historian discovering a new species or culture.
So these subterranean inhabitants, Kirk uses a few different names, doesn't he?
He does. You've got the familiar Siths or fairies, but also Slugmaith,
which means
the good people in Gaelic,
right?
Which really tells you something, right? There's a level of respect, maybe even a bit of, caution.
Makes sense. Don't want to offend the invisible neighbors.
Precisely. And then he lists other Gaelic terms, Hubsiged, Kaiben, Lisbartan, Siupsud. It's almost like he's creating a taxonomy.
Like he's trying to classify them scientifically.
In a way, yes. He tries to pin down their nature, describes them as partly invisible, often living in these little hillocks or mounds.
And people actually heard them.
Apparently so. Reported hearing sounds of baking or hammering, suggesting a parallel world existing, just out of sight. And of course, the brownies.
The household helpers. Tidy up at night.
Exactly. Those unseen drudges, a common figure in folklore, really.
And their diet sounds, specific. Kirk notes they eat very little.
Very little, and their food is exactly clean, served by pleasant children like enchanted puppets. That's his phrase.
Enchanted puppets. Okay, that's a bit creepy.
It is. But here's a really odd detail. They supposedly extract the pith of milk from cows using magic.
The pith, like the essence.
Yeah, the essence. Either using something called a hair tedder, we'll maybe get back to that, or drawing it from a spigot. And apparently cheese made from this magically sourced milk floats in water.
It floats. That's such a specific, almost bizarre detail. Why floating cheese?
Who knows? But it paints a picture, doesn't it, of them subtly drawing sustenance from our world through these, magical means. It positions the relationship as quite complex.
Not just enemies, not just friends, but something else.
Exactly. Intertwined.
They also seem really restless. Kirk says they relocate quarterly.
Yeah, traversing until doomsday. Because they dislike staying put. Their bodies are chameleon-like and they travel with bags and baggage.
I love that image. Little invisible beings pocketing their tiny bags every 3 months.
It's quite vivid. Perhaps it reflects older nomadic patterns or just the cyclical nature of seasons. Hard to say for sure.
In their homes, he describes them as large and fair, usually invisible to us.
But lit up by fir-lights, continual lamps, and fires, often seen without fuel.
So a magical, self-sustaining otherworld existing right next door, essentially.
Pretty much. And that idea, that hidden realm with its own rules, its own infrastructure, you find that everywhere in folklore, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. But the interactions weren't always harmless. He talks about fairies stealing women in childbirth.
He does. And leaving behind a lingering, voracious image, a sort of magical copy, a changeling, essentially.
That's terrifying, especially around childbirth, such a vulnerable time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the human nurses who were taken to care for fairy children, their fates were uncertain. They might die, be sent back, or even choose to stay. It was risky business.
So there's definitely a dangerous edge to them.
Oh, absolutely. And if you tried to spy on them, use invisibility ointments or whatever.
Bad idea.
Very bad. Kirk warns they'd punish you instantly. Strike you blind or dumb as with a puff of wind, like a built-in security system.
Don't mess with the Commonwealth.
Basically, yeah. They have boundaries, and crossing them unwelcomed has consequences.
Interestingly, he mentions protections. Highlanders putting bread, the Bible, or iron in beds.
Right. Especially when women were traveling. Cold iron is classic, of course.
But Kirk gives a reason. Something about hell.
Yeah, he offers this rather elaborate explanation that hell lies between cold storms and scalding metals, especially northern iron. So these creatures have this natural aversion to it.
Trying to find a theological logic for a folk belief? Fascinating.
It is. He's constantly trying to reconcile these things.
Now, he also gets into this link between fairyland and the dead.
Yes, and this is really key. He suggests these subterranean inhabitants might not be a literal race of small people underground, like Walter Scott later thought, but maybe a lingering memory of the Chthonian beings, the ancestors.
Whoa. So fairies as ancestral spirits, that's a deep connection.
It really is. It links fairy belief to ancient widespread ancestor veneration.
Yeah.
And look at the examples he potentially draws on, like Bessie Dunlop or Alison Pearson.
Right, these women who claimed contact not just with the fairy queen, but also with people they knew who had died.
Exactly. They reported seeing Thomas Reed, who died at the Battle of Pinkie, or Maitland of Lethington in Fairyland.
So fairyland becomes a kind of Hades, a home for the departed.
That seems to be the implication, yeah. It really blurs those lines.
And he draws parallels himself, doesn't he? Brownies and domovoys or Loris.
He does. Comparing the helpful household spirits here to the Russian domovoi or the Roman lares, it shows this common human tendency to imagine unseen beings that mirror our own lives and concerns.
He calls them an abstruse people, older than humans, whose furrows you can still see on hills.
Like traces of a vanished civilization?
But you couldn't normally see them, right? Only
Yeah.
people with second sight.
Primarily, yes. Especially during their quarterly flittings, their migrations. Second sight was the key.
Okay, so let's talk about second sight. How does Kirk define it?
He defines it as the ability to see these viewless forms of air, so fairies and the like, but also distant or future events, and crucially, the double man, or co-walker.
The co-walker, like a wraith or an astral body.
Something like that, yes. A spiritual double. It was a really strong belief in the Highlands.
And it wasn't just about seeing fairies.
No, it was broader. A kind of perception beyond normal senses, covering space, time, and this other layer of reality.
He mentions this Highland idea that every element has corresponding animals and connects the co-walker to the Roman guardian angel.
Yeah, it's like everything in our world has a counterpart in this abstruse world. The guardian angel is just another name for your co-walker in this view. It's about interconnectedness.
He even mentions seeing people who aren't there, and nods to Professor Sidgwick's later research, trying to sort coincidence from, well, something else.
Right. It's an early attempt to look critically at these experiences. Even if we'd explain them differently today, the sheer volume of reports made people like Kirk and later Sidgwick take notice.
And this co-walker, it could show up nearby or far away, sometimes doing things before the actual person did.
Exactly. Or that common thing, you think you see someone you know, then moments later, you meet the real person.
Yeah, happens all the time.
Well, for them, that wasn't just coincidence. It was a glimpse of the co-walker. It's about how you interpret everyday oddities.
So what happens to the co-walker in the end?
Kirk says it goes at last to his own herd, implying a limited lifespan for ghosts, maybe a century or so, according to some beliefs he recorded.
Joining the collective, the herd. Interesting.
It suggests a process, a journey after death.
They even had explanations for weird appetites. A joint eater.
Ha! Yes, an invisible being sharing your food, apparently making you ravenous. And again, fairies taking the pith and milk from cows, much like traditional witch lore.
It seems like a way to explain the unexplainable, right?
What?
Sudden illness, bad luck.
Absolutely. Blight, sickness, misfortune, this unseen world offered reasons, and sometimes maybe even culprits.
Now they're weapons, not iron, but stone.
Yes, specifically described as stone, like a yellow soft flint, shaped like barbed arrowheads, thrown with great force.
Elf shot.
Exactly. Neolithic arrowheads found in fields were often called elf shot or fairy darts, and Kirk claims they could cause fatal internal injuries without breaking the skin. He calls it thunderbolt subtlety.
Like being struck by lightning, but invisibly.
Sort of, yes. A wound appearing from nowhere adds to the mystery.
And seeing these things wasn't just passive viewing. Seers could interact.
Apparently. Second sight often came involuntarily in fits and raptures, but Kirk suggests seers could sometimes interact, fight them with iron, wrestle them. Sometimes seers themselves vanished and reappeared.
Risky stuff.
Very. He mentions that those considered unseen or unsanctified, called fae, were particularly vulnerable to being wounded by these fairy weapons, causing sudden unseen harm.
Being fey sounds like being marked somehow.
It does, like you've already got 1 foot across the threshold.
And getting second sight, the methods sound wild.
No.
A hair rope from a corpse.
A hair tedder, yes. Taken from a bier the frame a coffin rests on, wrapped around the waist in a specific way.
Like a ritual.
Definitely. Along with odd postures, like looking back between your legs or through a knothole in firwood. He even warns it's dangerous if the wind changes direction mid-ritual.
Wow, so serious business, not just a parlor trick.
Not at all. These seem like deliberate techniques to alter consciousness, to bridge worlds, likely tapping into ancestral connections, given the funerary items.
And you could get a quick glimpse by stepping on the seer's foot.
Yes, and looking over their right shoulder. Though Kirk disapproved, saw it as a kind of spiritual surrender, giving the seer power over you.
And the ability could fade if you moved away.
He observed that, yes, people moving from the Highlands and Isles to, say, America or Barbados sometimes lost the sight.
So it was tied to the place, the culture.
It strongly suggests that. Not just an innate talent, but something connected to the environment and the way of life there.
Okay, let's dig into what these subterraneans actually do. Kirk says they travel a lot, mimicking humans.
Yeah, presaging or aping human actions. But they also have their own dramas, disastrous doings, he calls them. Conventions, fights, injuries, even burials, both in the earth and, strangely, in the air.
Aerial burials.
Yeah.
Like sky burials.
It sounds like it. Suggests a different relationship with physicality, doesn't it? It reinforces this idea of a parallel society, mirroring ours, but distinctly different.
And their lifespan. Longer than humans, but they do end.
Yes, they eventually die or vanish, but their core belief, according to Kirk, is cyclical. Nothing truly perishes, it just changes form, gets renewed, everything moves, everything has life, a very animistic view.
Like the whole universe is alive and interconnected.
Precisely, contrasting sharply with a linear view of time and existence.
They supposedly have leaders, laws, but no religion. They disappear if you say God or Jesus.
That's what Kirk reports. It creates an interesting tension. Are they outside grace? Fearful of divine power, it marks a clear boundary between their realm and Christian belief.
Physically, he says they're like air, not like werewolves you can wound remotely.
Right. Their bodies can supposedly reform if divided. They don't get sick like us, but they do seem to dwindle with age, made of a different substance, essentially.
More fluid, less constrained.
Exactly. And he credits them with a kind of natural wisdom. Like animals sensing a storm, they understand the book of nature better than humans who are weighed down by grosser dregs.
So, closer to nature, more intuitive.
That's the idea. It elevates them slightly, suggesting humans lost something along the way.
And those fairy hills, sacred ground, right?
Yeah.
Connected to ancestors.
Absolutely. Considered impious to disturb them, believed to house the souls of predecessors. Even small mounds near graveyards were seen as waiting places for souls. Again, weaving fairies, death, and ancestors together.
It's a really integrated worldview.
It is. Now, Kirk also includes this report from Lord Tarbet about second sight.
Right. Tarbet was skeptical at first.
Very. But after making inquiries around 1652, he apparently became convinced. Found it was more common in the Isles, affected all sorts of people, wasn't always welcome.
So Tarbet adds some outside credibility.
Definitely. An investigator, initially doubtful, lends wake. He interviewed seers, checked with respected figures like Sir James MacDonald, Sir Norman MacLeod.
And they all backed it up.
Generally, yes. provided corroborating accounts, specific examples. Tarbet even relates this story.
The coffin one.
Yeah. A seer predicts seeing a coffin carried out of the house. Later, some English soldiers arrive carrying a wounded comrade with a broken arm.
And they place him.
Exactly where the seer had foreseen the coffin. Pretty compelling, right? Hard to dismiss as just chance.
You can see why people believed. Tarbet made other observations too.
He did. Noted women seemed to have it less often, or their predictions were less certain. Importantly, he argued it wasn't inherently criminal, as it could happen involuntarily.
That's a key point given the times.
Crucial. He also mentioned seers seeing the prematurely dead in the Siths, and that strong desire could help acquire the sight. Visions of absent friends were seen as real messages.
So trying to understand the mechanics of it almost.
In a way. And Kirk agrees with Tarbet's descriptions. He interprets one case a maid seeing her own image as her co-walker.
Ah, connecting it back.
Exactly. Kirk suggests the Commonwealth might reveal themselves innocently, like us watching fish. Then he asks these big questions. Are they prone to vice?
And his answer.
Less inclined than humans because their bodies are less gross, but still imperfect. They expect advancement, have degrees of virtue, stronger than men, but usually only harm humans when commissioned, like avenging angels almost. Haunt wild places. Piety protects you.
Okay. And do they reproduce? That seems like a tricky one.
It is. Kirk argues spirits were created all at once, souls are in probation. He says, look, if a soul can inhabit an earthly body, why not an airy one? If air can have a body, why can't a spirit use one for procreation? Otherwise, their numbers would just dwindle.
Trying to make it logically consistent within his framework.
Always.
Yeah.
He's constantly defending against the obvious accusations, diabolical compacts, witchcraft.
How does he do that?
He argues these interactions aren't usually sought out. They can happen accidentally or become natural, just part of nature. Seeking it might be wrong, but the fairies might just show up innocently.
They're not necessarily demonic.
Yeah, that's his argument. He points to the conviction of the seers, even former skeptics, as evidence of reality. Draws parallels to Elisha's servant seeing angels, Intelligences traverse the earth unseen.
Using the Bible to support it. Clever.
Very. He stresses that seers believe because of infallible instances, not for gain or revenge. Curiosity could be sinful if it's pointless, but the sight itself, it's like a new science, not an article of faith.
And it can run in families, right? Mm-hmm. Without consent.
Yes. So not inherently sinful, maybe just an affliction. His conclusion is firm. These aerial intelligences are real. The sight is clear, lawful, and not deception.
He's really building a case.
A careful, reasoned case within the constraints of his time and beliefs.
He also touches on charms and spells,
right,
briefly, connected to Christianity.
Often, yes. Incorporating Bible verses. Some saw them as continued miracles, their power coming from the original deviser. There was this old practice of swapping names using a symbolic name for something to gain power over it.
Like sympathetic magic?
Sort of. And people believed they worked. He gives examples expelling the unbeast, a charm for a child's headache. But he adds a warning.
Be careful.
Yeah. Cautioning against superstitious rites overshadowing actual faith in God's commandments. So these weren't just random words, were they? They met real needs, addressed anxieties, absolutely. Protection, healing, everyday concerns. The blend with Christianity shows how folk beliefs merged with formal religion. It was syncretic.
Now let's bring in some commentary from Walker Between Worlds. It highlights Kirk and others like Aubrey realizing this knowledge was fading.
Yes. That commentary points out that figures like Kirk saw valuable cultural knowledge disappearing, partly due to Protestant reformers trying to stamp out pagan elements.
Cromwell and the like.
Exactly. And also the rise of the Royal Society, the new science, making these older worldviews seem, outdated. The Gaelic Highlands were isolated, so the beliefs lingered longer there.
And the commentary sees Kirk's book as more than just folklore.
Much more. As a survey of seership, Second Sight, maybe even multiple dimensions. It draws parallels to shamanism, Celtic religion, Native American traditions, even mentions Carlos Castaneda.
Wow. Wide-ranging connections.
It also notes the political interest in Second Sight people like Samuel Pepys, John Dee back in Elizabeth's time, spying potential, protective spells in battle.
Thomas the Rhymer gets mentioned.
As the classic example of someone initiated into the fairy realm, gaining prophecy and poetry. The commentary stresses the unorthodox, semi-pagan feel of the Christianity mixed with these beliefs.
And that these aren't cute Victorian fairies.
Definitely not. It emphasizes Kirk's philosophical argument, linking fairies to spirits of place, genie loci, the dead, ancestral traditions, and his storytelling style reflecting Gaelic oral tradition.
It really broadens the scope.
It does, puts Kirk in a much larger context of esoteric thought and cultural history.
The commentary digs into symbolism too. Quarter days, seasonal shifts, Celtic geomancy.
Yeah, the idea of sacred landscapes. It interprets the elemental nature of entities as maybe a counter to Catholic angels and demons. Sees the co-walker as a magical technique, comparing it to things like conversation with the holy guardian angel in later magic.
Fairy abductions as initiation.
Right, like bardic initiations, threshold experiences, death, return, or staying. Common themes worldwide at sacred sites.
And the fairies dressing like locals.
Connects them directly to the land, to Celtic pagan roots. It mentions elf bolts again, Kirk possibly being a healer as the seventh son, ghosts wanting things resolved.
The rituals for second sight are seen as threshold ceremonies too.
Yes, involving ancestors, the hair rope, altered states, looking through legs not whole, the danger of the wind changing peril during initiation, looking through holes or rings to see the other world is a common motif.
It mentions specific cases too, like Janet of Colonsay.
And a woman fasting and being transported may be conceiving via fairy contact. It highlights Kirk arguing these otherworld traditions are found globally, touches on Scottish traditions like the Mason word, soldier's charms.
Biblical links again.
Yeah, interpreting Bible passages about spirits, seeing at a distance the power of Jesus' name, then dives into ballad symbolism, Tam Lin.
Green clothing meaning unity with the land, pulling flowers, summoning guardians, pregnancy as crossing worlds.
Chess-playing maidens as fates. Tam Lin's enchantment, his release by Janet's true love, it reads the ballad as a metaphor for inner transformation.
And Thomas the Rhymer, the three roads.
Wickedness, righteousness, and the middle way to fair elfland. That middle path is seen as communication between worlds, enlightenment, the path of the savior even.
So Elfland isn't just a way with the fairies.
No, it's a path of potential transformation. Thomas's initiation gives him prophecy, connects him to the land, green clothes again. He's seen as still existing as a guide in inner worlds. It even briefly mentions the Vita Merlini's cosmology.
That's incredibly rich. So much symbolism packed in there.
It shows how deep these seemingly simple folktales can run, connecting to mythology, psychology, spirituality, a whole complex worldview.
Okay, so to bring our deep dive into Kirk's secret Commonwealth towards a close, we've really journeyed into a different reality, haven't we?
We absolutely have. Explored this 17th century view of a hidden fairy world, the whole phenomenon of second sight, and how deeply it was all woven into Scottish culture and religion back then.
It's just amazing how Kirk documented it. It gives us this window
into a worldview that's largely faded, at least in the mainstream West. A world where the line between seen and unseen was just much thinner, more porous.
It really makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
What does this tell us about how different people, different cultures make sense of the world?
And how beliefs in things we can't necessarily measure or see scientifically still shape human experience, maybe in ways we don't always acknowledge.
Are there echoes of this stuff still around today?
Yeah.
Maybe hidden in plain sight?
That's the big question, isn't it? What do we filter out? What counts as real? Kirk's work kind of challenges our modern assumptions, invites us to consider other ways of knowing.
Definitely food for thought. So if your curiosity is buzzing like ours is right now, you should absolutely try and find a copy of The Secret Commonwealth.
Or just delve deeper into folklore, psychical research history. Look into Robert Kirk himself, or figures like Thomas the Rhymer. Explore second sight in other cultures.
There's a ton out there. Kirk's book is such a unique starting point, though.
A truly compelling doorway into humanity's long, complex relationship with the unseen.
So here's a final thought for you to mull over. Maybe the secret Commonwealth isn't entirely gone. Perhaps we've just, stopped looking properly. Or maybe our own kind of sight has just gotten clouded by all the noise and distraction of the modern world.